The morning was cold and dry, the way Nevada mornings always were in October. The sky was the color of old tin, and the wind moved low across the desert floor, pushing thin lines of dust along the cracked asphalt. Calvin Pruitt drove his pickup truck with one hand on the wheel and a toothpick in the corner of his mouth, the way he always did when he was not thinking about anything in particular. He was thinking about the auction. He had seen the listing 3 days earlier, tucked near the bottom of a government surplus notice pinned to the board outside the county post office. Most of the listings were the usual things: office furniture, old vehicles, decommissioned equipment with serial numbers scratched off. But one entry had caught his eye. Hangar 14C, 40 miles east of Reno, sold for back taxes, contents unknown, sold as is. The starting bid was $10. Calvin had no real reason to go. His shop back in town had 3 cars waiting on him and a busted radiator hose that was not going to fix itself. He was not a rich man, and he was not a foolish one either. But he had spent 22 years in the Air Force fixing things that other people had given up on, and that experience had given him a particular feeling, a low hum in the back of his mind that said, "Go look." He trusted that feeling. It had never steered him wrong. The auction site was a flat stretch of government-owned land surrounded by chain-link fence and dry brush. There were 4 other people there when Calvin arrived, all of them standing near a folding table where a federal agent in a tan jacket was shuffling papers. The other bidders were there for a lot of decommissioned office chairs and 2 old government pickup trucks. Nobody else seemed interested in the hangar. The agent's name tag said Dale Conroy. He was a tall, thin man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the look of someone who had processed too many surplus auctions to be surprised by anything. Calvin asked him what was in the hangar. Dale looked at his clipboard. He flipped one page, then another. Then he said, without much interest, that the file listed the contents as recovered aerospace salvage, origin disputed. He said the hangar had been on the books since 1963 and nobody had opened it in at least 40 years that he could find record of. Calvin asked if he could look inside before bidding. Dale said no. Sold as is meant as is. Calvin nodded. He chewed his toothpick. He looked out across the flat land toward the distant shape of the hangar, which was just visible past a low rise, its metal roof dull and rusted under the gray sky. When the bidding reached Hangar 14C, Calvin raised his hand and said $10. Nobody else moved. Dale looked around, waited the required 10 seconds, and then wrote Calvin's name on a form and handed him a receipt and a key on a plain metal ring. That was it. Calvin Pruitt drove home the owner of a hangar he had never seen the inside of, having spent $10 and about 40 minutes of his morning. He told himself he would go look at the weekend. He went that same afternoon. The road out to the hangar was not on any map he had. He found it by following the directions on the auction receipt, which took him off the main highway onto a crumbling 2-lane road and then onto a dirt track that had once been graded flat but was now badly rutted and overgrown on either side. The hangar sat alone at the end of the track, surrounded by nothing. It was larger than he had expected. From the outside it looked like any other military storage building, long, low, with a curved metal roof and no windows. The walls were sheet metal, gray-brown with rust in long streaks where the bolts had bled through the paint over decades. There was a padlock on the main door. Calvin's key fit it. He pushed the door open. It moved slowly, the hinges stiff and grinding, and the sound it made was deep and reluctant, like something very old being asked to move for the first time in a long while. A wave of air came out at him, cool and dry, with a faint metallic smell, like the inside of an old engine. Calvin stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust. The hangar was not empty. He did not understand what he was looking at first. The shape inside the hangar was too large for the building to contain, and yet there it was. It filled nearly the entire interior, from wall to wall, and its hull rose close to the ceiling 20 meters above. It was a vessel of some kind, he could see that much. It had the general shape of a ship, though unlike any aircraft or spacecraft he had ever seen in his years of service. The hull was dark, almost black in the low light, and the surface was not smooth but had a faint texture to it, like scales or overlapping plates. There were deep gouges along the port side, long and clean, the kind of damage that spoke of something violent and deliberate. Weapons fire. Calvin had seen enough of it on aircraft that came back from places they should not have gone. He walked forward slowly, his boots quiet on the concrete floor. The vessel was enormous. 300 feet, maybe more. He walked the length of it, looking up at the hull, running the beam of his flashlight across the surface. The damage was extensive on one side but not catastrophic. Whatever had hit this thing had hit it hard, but the ship had survived. The metal, if it was metal, did not look like aluminum or steel or any alloy he recognized. It was darker and had a slight sheen to it, almost like oil on water, that shifted faintly as the light moved. He crouched down near the bow and pulled a multimeter from his jacket pocket. He pressed the probes against the hull. 0 resistance. He checked the probes. He tested them against his belt buckle, got a normal reading. He pressed them against the hull again. 0. He stayed crouched there for a moment, looking at the reading, then looked up at the vessel above him. His flashlight caught a long seam in the hull that might have been a door. There were markings near it, not letters, not numbers, not anything he could name. They were pressed into the hull itself, precise and deliberate. Calvin stood up. He put the multimeter back in his pocket. He walked to the middle of the hull, where the surface was unmarked and smooth, and he put his hand flat against it. The ship hummed. It was a single, low vibration, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. It lasted no more than 2 seconds. Then it stopped. Calvin stood very still. He did not move his hand. Outside, the wind pushed against the hangar walls and made the metal tick and creak the way old buildings did. Inside, there was nothing but silence and the smell of old metal and something else he could not quite name, something electric and faintly warm. He stood there for a long time. Then he lowered his hand, turned, and walked back to the door. He stepped outside into the flat gray afternoon light. He looked back at the hangar once. He got in his truck. He sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Then he took the toothpick out of his mouth, looked at it, and put it in the ashtray. He said to nobody in particular, "All right. Let's see what you need." He started the engine and drove back to town to get his tools. Calvin did not tell anyone about the ship for 3 weeks. He went back to the hangar every evening after closing his shop, driving out alone on the dirt track with his tools in the bed of the pickup. He brought a work light on a long cable, running it off a generator he kept in the truck. He brought a kit bag full of instruments, voltmeters, pressure gauges, calipers, a small endoscope he used for looking inside engine blocks. He brought a thermos of coffee and a folding chair. He did not try to get inside the ship. Not yet. He just looked, measured, and thought. The whole material was unlike anything he could identify. It was not aluminum. It was not titanium. It was not any composite he had seen in his years working on military aircraft. It had no measurable electrical resistance. It had no measurable thermal variation. The surface temperature was exactly the same at every point he checked, regardless of where he pointed his heat gun. When he pressed a steel chisel against it as hard as he could, it left no mark. The ship did not care about his chisel. The battle damage on the port side was real, though. Deep gouges, some of them a foot wide and several feet long, carved into the hull in ways that should have compromised the interior. But when he shone his endoscope into one of the narrower gouges, he could see the edges were not raw. They were smooth, rounded slightly, as if the material had begun to close back in on itself. The damage was healing. Slowly, but it was healing. Calvin sat with that for a long time one night, drinking his coffee in the folding chair and looking at the hull. He had spent his whole career fixing things that could not fix themselves. This ship, apparently, had a different opinion about what needed fixing and what it could handle on its own. He respected that. In the 4th week, he called his niece. Lorena Pruitt was 29 years old and worked in the materials engineering department at the university in Reno. She had her mother's eyes and her uncle's stubbornness and a mind that, in Calvin's opinion, was wasted on academic papers. She had grown up spending summers in his shop, handing him tools and asking questions about everything, and she was one of the few people he trusted without reservation. He told her on the phone that he had found something and that he needed a second opinion. He told her it was important. He told her to bring whatever instruments she used at the lab, the portable ones. She asked what kind of something. He said the kind that changed things. She drove out the next Saturday morning and stood in the hangar doorway for a full minute without speaking. Calvin stood beside her with his hands in his pockets and his toothpick in his mouth and waited. She finally said, very quietly, "What is that?" Calvin said he did not know yet. But he was working on it. Lorena spent the next 6 hours going over the hull with the instruments she had brought. She took samples, or tried to. The surface would not yield material to any cutting tool she had. She ran spectroscopic analysis on trace residue from one of the shallow scrape marks and got readings that the instrument flagged as outside its calibration range. She pressed her hands against different points of the hull and once, by accident, held both palms flat against the surface near the bow for longer than a moment. The ship hummed. She stepped back fast, her heart loud in her ears. She looked at Calvin. He nodded. He said it did that. She pressed her hands against the hull again, deliberately this time. The hum came again, the same single, low pulse. She held her breath and counted. 2 seconds. Then silence. She turned around and sat down on the concrete floor right where she was and did not say anything for a while. They worked together from that point on, meeting at the hangar every weekend and some evenings. Lorena brought better instruments from the lab each time, borrowing them carefully, logging them out for extended projects without specifying what the project was. Her analysis of the whole material grew slowly into something that kept her awake at night. The alloy was not simply a strong material. It was an active one. At the atomic level, the structure was constantly rearranging itself, not randomly, but in ordered, purposeful patterns. The material was, as far as she could determine, self-repairing in real time. The battle damage she measured in her first visit had closed by another 12% by her third. The ship was fixing itself. It had probably been fixing itself, alone in the dark, for 60 years. Then, on a Tuesday night in late October, everything changed. Calvin was working near what he had come to think of as the engine section, rewiring a secondary conduit that had melted sometime in the distant past. Lorena was at the other end of the hangar, cataloging markings on the hull near what they believed was an entry hatch. The work light hummed. The generator outside chugged steadily. It was a normal evening. Then every screen in the hangar lit up. There were no screens in the hangar. That was the thing. There had been no screens the day before. But in that moment, across 3 sections of the hull near the bow, panels had opened, smooth and silent, revealing dark surfaces that were now glowing with a soft blue-white light. And on each of those surfaces was a single symbol. A circle. With a diagonal line through it. Pulsing slowly, like a heartbeat. Lorena walked to the nearest panel and stared at it. Her face went very still in the way it did when she was thinking hard. She said, quietly, that she had seen that symbol before. In a classified xenolinguistics archive she had accessed through a university database 2 years ago, a paper written by a government researcher in the early 1980s. The paper was about communication attempts. The symbol was listed as appearing in multiple separate contact events, none officially acknowledged, and its translated meaning was approximate but consistent. Calvin asked what it meant. Lorena said it meant, "I am waiting for authorization." Calvin looked at the symbol for a long moment. Then he walked to the nearest panel, dragged his folding chair over, sat down in front of it, and folded his hands in his lap. He said, "All right. My name is Calvin. I fixed your starboard coupling this morning. I figure that earns me a conversation." The symbol disappeared. The panels stayed lit. There was a long silence, the kind of silence that had weight to it, that felt like something was happening on the other side of it. Then, from somewhere inside the ship, a voice came. It was deep and slow and smooth, like water moving over stone at the bottom of a very old river. It said one word. Confirmed. Calvin nodded slowly. Lorena stood behind him, her hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide. Calvin picked up his coffee thermos, poured himself a cup, and said, "Good. So let's talk about what you need." The ship's name, in the language of the people who built it, meant something close to the one that remained. Calvin thought that was a good name. He did not use it, though. He called the ship Old Sam, because it was old, and because it reminded him in a strange way of a mechanic he had known in the Air Force, a quiet man named Sam who never said much but always knew exactly what was wrong and exactly how to fix it. The ship accepted the name without comment, which Calvin took as agreement. Old Sam talked slowly and carefully at first, the way anyone does when they are learning how much they can trust a new situation. It answered direct questions with direct answers and did not offer more than was asked. But it answered everything Calvin asked, and it answered honestly, and over the weeks that followed, it began to fill in the shape of what it was. It had been built by an alliance of 7 civilizations, each contributing parts of its architecture, the whole material from one species, the propulsion from another, the defensive systems from a third, the intelligence core assembled from all 7 together. It was the most complex thing any of those civilizations had ever made, and it had been built for one purpose: to defend. Not to attack, not to conquer, not to threaten. To stand between things that needed protecting and things that wanted to destroy them. The fleet it had been part of was gone. Destroyed 60,000 years ago in a conflict that old Sam described with the flat, careful tone of something that had accepted its grief long ago. Old Sam had survived because it had kept moving, kept looking, kept doing what it was built to do. It had eventually come to Earth, drawn by something it could not fully explain, something in the signal of the planet, and had been damaged in a brief encounter with a military aircraft in 1958, coming down in the Mojave. The recovery team that found it had made the only decision they knew how to make: lock it away and hope it stayed quiet. It had stayed quiet. It had waited. Lorena, working through the ship's data core with old Sam's careful guidance, spent most of November mapping what the ship could actually do. The defensive systems were beyond anything she had a framework for. She had to build new frameworks, sometimes from scratch, sometimes by adapting existing physics in ways that made her feel like she was bending rules that should not bend. Old Sam was patient with her questions and seemed, in its quiet way, to enjoy the process. She was deep in this work when the first knock on the hangar door came. The man outside was tall, with a weathered face and a calm way of standing that Calvin recognized immediately, the posture of someone who had spent a long time around people who were not telling him the truth and had learned to be comfortable with that. His name was Pete Harlan. He was a federal investigator out of the Defense Intelligence Field Office in San Francisco. He had a government ID and a pleasant smile and a small notebook that he kept putting in his shirt pocket and taking out again. He and Calvin sat across from each other at a diner in town, because Calvin had agreed to a conversation and had carefully picked a place that was nowhere near the hangar. The coffee was bad. The pie was decent. Pete asked about the auction, about the surplus listing, about what Calvin had found in the hangar. He asked the questions in a gentle, interested way, like a man who was genuinely curious and had no agenda at all. Calvin answered carefully. He said he had bought the hangar for the scrap value. He said there was some old aircraft equipment inside, badly rusted, probably not worth much. He said he was still sorting through it. Pete nodded and wrote things in his notebook and smiled pleasantly and said that sounded reasonable. He asked if he could come take a look sometime. Calvin said sure, he would let Pete know when he had things cleaned up a bit. Pete left a card on the table and said no rush, whenever it was convenient. Calvin watched Pete's rental car leave the parking lot, then sat alone with his coffee for a while. He drove straight to the hangar. He told old Sam they were going to have company eventually. He asked how long it would take to make the ship look like something other than what it was. Old Sam said that was not possible. Calvin said he figured as much. He asked what they could do. Old Sam suggested they move faster. That same night, 600 million miles away, 3 monitoring stations registered old Sam's power signature. The stations were automated, and they had been running quietly for a very long time, watching and waiting and sending their observations to places that were very far from the solar system. The observations they sent that night were flagged as high priority. 12 days later, a transmission arrived at the hangar. It did not come through any antenna or receiver or piece of equipment that Calvin or Lorena had installed. It came through old Sam directly, appearing on the hull displays as a stream of symbols that old Sam translated into English in real time as they arrived. The message was from a species called the Varek. It was formal and careful and very old in its structure, the way legal documents are old, built up over generations of use until the language becomes ritual. But the meaning was clear. The Varek knew old Sam was active. They wanted to know who held the authorization codes. Calvin stood in front of the display and read the message twice. Then he looked at old Sam's nearest panel and asked if the Varek were friendly. Old Sam said the Varek were one of the 7 who built it. They were not hostile. They were cautious. Calvin asked who else might be paying attention. Old Sam was quiet for a moment. Then it said that the Varek message was likely not the only one that had been sent. There were other civilizations that monitored its signature. Some were simply curious. One, old Sam said, was not. Calvin asked about that one. Old Sam brought up a new display. A name appeared, the Great Compact, followed by a description that took several minutes to read. 17 star systems. A governing structure built on force and control. A long institutional memory that included the original defensive fleet that Old Sam had served, and a long institutional fear of what Old Sam could do. The Grey Compact had spent a great deal of time and energy ensuring that nothing like Old Sam would ever be operational again. Calvin read through all of it. Then he said, "And they know you're awake?" Old Sam said yes. Calvin said, "And that's a problem." Old Sam said that a message from the Grey Compact had also arrived, though it had come through different channels and Old Sam had delayed presenting it because it wanted to provide context first. Calvin said, "Show me." The message was short. It said that the vessel designated the one that remained was considered a prohibited class weapon under articles established 60,000 years ago. It said the vessel must be surrendered to Grey Compact authority or destroyed within 1 standard galactic year. It said that failure to comply would result in direct action against the planet of unauthorized origin. Calvin read it once. He folded his hands behind his back. He stood there for a moment. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and took out a small folded piece of paper, a hardware store receipt, and a pen, and he wrote the deadline date on the back of the receipt. He put it in his pocket. He said to Old Sam, "How much can we get done in 11 months?" Old Sam said, "More than they expect." Calvin said, "Good enough. Let's get started." The whiteboard had been Lorena's idea. Calvin had never used a whiteboard in his life. He kept everything in his head or on the back of whatever paper was closest, but Lorena said this was too big for the back of a receipt, and she was right. The board was propped against the port hull of Old Sam, and on it Calvin had written 3 words in large letters at the top, "What we have." Under that, in smaller writing, was a list. 1 ship, mostly functional. 1 AI, fully functional. 2 people who knew what was going on. 11 months. Pete Harlan was not on the whiteboard yet. But he was going to have to be. Pete had come back. Not to the hangar, he had not pushed that, but he had returned to the diner twice more, each time a little more specific in his questions, each time a little harder to deflect. Calvin was a good liar when he needed to be, but Pete was a good listener, and the combination was starting to feel like a slow pressure building somewhere important. The decision to bring Pete in had not been Calvin's alone. He had put it to Old Sam, which was becoming a habit, not because he needed the ship's permission, but because Old Sam had 60,000 years of accumulated experience with exactly the kind of situation they were in, and Calvin saw no reason to ignore good advice. Old Sam had said that Pete Harlan had the look of a man who would rather know an uncomfortable truth than live comfortably with a convenient one. It said that kind of person was useful and also, if left outside, eventually became a problem. Calvin had called Pete that evening and told him to come to the hangar. Pete had stood in the hangar doorway for longer than Lorena had. He did not say anything for a full 3 minutes. Then he walked forward, slowly, the way you walk toward something that might be dangerous or might be wonderful and you are not yet sure which. He walked the full length of Old Sam, looking up at the hull. He came back to where Calvin and Lorena were standing. He put his notebook in his shirt pocket without opening it. He said, "I need to make a phone call." Calvin said, "Not yet, you don't." They sat down together, all 3 of them, and Calvin and Lorena told Pete everything. Old Sam contributed occasionally, its voice coming from the hull panels in that slow, deep way that made Pete go very still the first time he heard it. By the end of 2 hours, Pete had taken his notebook out and put it back 4 times without writing anything in it. He finally said, "The filing deadline for my field report was last Friday." Calvin said he was aware of that. Pete looked at Old Sam's hull for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need me to do?" Lorena's breakthrough came 3 weeks later, on a gray December morning when the heater in the hangar was running full and the whiteboard had grown to cover 2 full panels of notes and diagrams. She had been working through the mathematics of Old Sam's defensive field architecture for 6 weeks, translating the ship's internal system descriptions into frameworks that human physics could approach from the side, if not directly. What she had assumed was a shield, a barrier that stopped incoming energy or mass, turned out to be something entirely different. It was not a shield at all. It was a condition. A state of spacetime, locally applied, in which entropy did not apply to anything Old Sam designated as protected. Weapons did not deflect off it. They did not explode against it. They simply ceased to be relevant within its boundary, the way a fire ceases to be relevant when there is no air. The physics still worked. The harm just did not. She stood at the whiteboard for a long time after she understood this, her marker hanging at her side. Then she said, to no one in particular, We built cathedrals with less than this. The government arrived in January. It was not a surprise. Pete had known it was coming and had done what he could to slow the process and shape how it arrived, which was why it came as a convoy of black vehicles rather than a military operation, and why the officer in charge walked to the hangar door alone rather than with an armed unit behind him. His name was Claude Avery. Brigadier General, career military, the kind of man who had built a life on clarity and chain of command and was looking at something that fit neatly into neither. He was not unreasonable. Calvin could see that immediately, which made the conversation easier and harder at the same time. Avery said the ship was a national security asset and needed to come under appropriate authority. Calvin said the ship had been purchased through a legal government auction and the bill of sale was filed with the county clerk's office in Washoe County. Avery said that was not the point. Calvin said with respect, "General," he thought it was exactly the point. Old Sam, without being asked, locked every external door in the hangar complex. The sound of the locks engaging was quiet and final, like a period at the end of a sentence. Avery looked at the ceiling. He looked at Old Sam. He looked at Calvin. He said, "Is it going to do whatever you tell it to?" Calvin said he would not put it that way. He said Old Sam made its own decisions. But they had an understanding. Avery spent 3 days at the site, talking to Calvin, talking to Lorena, talking to Pete, and twice attempting to address Old Sam directly. Old Sam answered his questions politely and thoroughly and did not change its position on anything. On the third evening, Avery sat down with Calvin in the folding chairs they kept near the bow and did not say anything for a while. The generator hummed outside. The work lights were warm. Avery finally said, "You understand what's coming?" Calvin said he did. Avery said, 47 ships. The report from the outer solar monitors is not classified anymore, at least not from me. 47 warships, sitting at the edge of the system, waiting on a deadline. Calvin said, "I know." Avery looked at him. He said, "And you're not scared?" Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't say that. I said I know. Those are different things." They worked out the arrangement over the following 2 weeks. The government acknowledged the auction sale as legally binding, a fact nobody had thought to question before because nobody had imagined it would matter. Calvin retained ownership. Lorena was named Chief Technical Liaison. Pete was given a formal role that had a long official title, meaning nobody quite knew what to do with him, but everyone agreed he should be there. A joint team was assembled and given workspace at the site. Old Sam consented to all of it. It expressed no opinion on the arrangement except to note, once, quietly, that it had been waiting 60,000 years and had learned that good outcomes generally required patience and people willing to do unglamorous work. Calvin said that was about right. He picked up his tools and went back to work. The morning the Gray Compact's fleet arrived, Calvin was drinking coffee. He was standing at the back of the Joint Operations Center, which was really just the hangar with better lighting, more folding tables, and a lot of screens that the military team had bolted to the walls over the past 3 months. The screens were showing data from the outer solar system monitoring stations, and the data was clear. 47 ships had dropped out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the system at 4:47 in the morning, Nevada time. They were sitting there, not moving, at a distance that put them comfortably outside any immediate threat range. Old Sam had flagged the arrival before any human instrument detected it. The operations center was loud now, full of people doing jobs that needed doing, voices on radios and keyboards being worked fast. General Avery was at the main display, watching the fleet positions update every 30 seconds. Lorena was at the data table, 3 screens open, working through calculations she had been running in some form since December. Pete was standing near the door with his notebook, writing in it for the first time in months. Calvin stood at the back with his coffee and thought. The Gray Compact sent a final message at 6:12 in the morning. Old Sam translated it and put it on the main display without being asked. It said the deadline had arrived. It said the vessel must be surrendered immediately or the planet would face consequences. It said this was not a negotiation. The operations center went quiet when the message appeared. The kind of quiet that rooms go when everyone stops what they are doing at the same moment. Calvin set down his coffee cup. He walked to the front of the room, past Lorena's table, past Pete, past the military personnel who moved aside without being asked. He walked to the main display where Avery was standing. Avery looked at him. He did not say anything. Calvin looked at the display. Then he looked at old Sam's nearest hull panel and said, "Sam, you know what to do." What happened next was visible from every telescope and satellite and monitoring station on Earth, and from the gray compact fleet at the edge of the solar system, and from a Varec observation vessel that had been following the situation quietly from a discreet distance for several months. Old Sam powered up fully for the first time in 60,000 years. The event registered on every seismograph and electromagnetic sensor in the northern hemisphere. The air in the hangar changed, not dramatically, not dangerously, but noticeably, the way the air changes just before a storm when the pressure shifts. The hull of the ship, which had been dark and quiet for so long, lit from within, a deep blue-white light that came through the surface in patterns, moving along the hull like current through water. Then the field expanded. It moved outward from the Nevada desert at the speed of light, spherical and perfect, touching nothing it passed through, disturbing nothing. It went through the hangar walls without affecting them. It went across the American continent and out across the oceans and up through the atmosphere and into the dark. It passed through the moon and left it unchanged. It kept going, growing, until it enclosed the entire inner solar system in a boundary that was not visible to any instrument but was absolutely, completely real. Inside that boundary, old Sam was the condition of things. The gray compact fleet opened fire at 7:03 in the morning. All 47 ships fired simultaneously. Every weapons system each ship carried was brought to bear on the boundary, on the planet beyond it, on the signal source in the Nevada desert. The combined output was, by old Sam's later accounting, enough energy to sterilize the surface of a planet twice over. Not one joule of it crossed the boundary. The weapons did not deflect. There was no visible explosion, no light show, no barrier that could be seen. The energy left the gray compact ships and traveled at the appropriate velocities and simply ceased to be relevant before it arrived. It was as if the idea of harm had been removed from that portion of the universe, quietly and completely, and nothing could put it back. The gray compact fleet kept firing for 11 minutes. Then they stopped. The operations center was very quiet. Nobody was talking. Lorena had her hands flat on her data table and was staring at the readings. Pete had stopped writing. Avery was looking at the main display with an expression that was difficult to read, not relief, not triumph, something more complicated than either. Calvin stood at the display and watched the fleet positions. The 47 ships were motionless at the edge of the system. The weapons signatures had gone cold. He asked old Sam what they were doing. Old Sam said they were deciding. At 7:21, the Varec fleet, which had been sitting at a careful distance behind the gray compact's position, opened a communication channel. The message was addressed not to old Sam, not to any government or military authority, but to Calvin Pruitt, by name. It was in clean, careful English that must have taken considerable effort to learn in a short time. It said, "We apologize for our lateness in arriving. We did not know what to expect from the ones who woke the ship. We understand better now." Calvin read it twice. He said to Lorena, "They know my name." Lorena said, "Old Sam told them." Calvin looked at old Sam's panel. He said, "You told them about me." Old Sam said, "I told them the truth. That a man who fixes things found me in the dark and decided I was worth talking to. They found this significant." At 7:44, the gray compact fleet turned. Not one by one, all 47 ships together, as if a decision had been made by the whole fleet at once, or by whatever central authority commanded them. They turned and they left the solar system. There was no message. No formal withdrawal. No statement. They simply went. Calvin watched the positions update until the fleet signatures were gone from the display. He asked old Sam why they had left without a word. Old Sam said, "Because there is a category in their thinking for an enemy they can fight. There is no category for something that cannot be touched by anything they know how to do. They will need time to build a new category." Calvin thought about this. He said, "How long will that take?" Old Sam said, "Long enough." That evening, after the military personnel had filed their reports and the official communications had gone out to the people who needed to receive them, and after Avery had shaken Calvin's hand without saying much and Pete had filled an entire new notebook and driven back to his motel, Calvin and Lorena sat alone in the hangar with old Sam. The ship was quiet again. The glow along the hull had faded back to its normal dark sheen. The work lights were on. The generator hummed. Lorena sat on the concrete floor with her back against the hull, looking up at the ceiling. She said, "What comes next, Sam?" Old Sam said, "That is entirely up to you." She said, "There are other ships out there, aren't there? From the fleet. Wrecked, drifting, waiting." Old Sam said, "Yes." She said, "And there are other civilizations that could use the kind of help you were built to give." Old Sam said, "Yes." She said, "And none of them knew we were worth paying attention to until tonight." Old Sam said, "They know now." Lorena was quiet for a moment. Then she looked over at Calvin, who was standing near the bow with a wrench in his hand, looking up at a section of the hull he had been meaning to get to for 3 weeks. She said, "Uncle Calvin. What are you doing?" He said, "There's a coupling up here that's been bothering me since November. Figured I'd get to it tonight." She laughed. It was a real laugh, tired and warm, and it went up into the empty space of the hangar and faded. Calvin got his ladder. He climbed up to the coupling. He worked in silence for a while, and the only sounds were the small sounds of careful work being done, the click of a ratchet, the soft scrape of a tool on old metal, the occasional quiet word from old Sam identifying the right tension for a particular fitting. Outside, the Nevada sky was clear and full of stars. More stars than most people stopped to count. And somewhere among them, in ways that would take time to become clear, 17 civilizations were updating what they knew about a species that had just bought the most powerful warship in the known galaxy for $10 and a willingness to show up and do the work. The hangar door stayed open a while longer, the light from inside falling out across the desert floor. Then Calvin came down from the ladder and said the coupling was good. Old Sam said, "Thank you." Calvin said, "Don't mention it." He put his tools away, and the hangar went quiet, and the night settled in around it, and the stars went on.